The red and blue lights flashed, casting bright streaks across the dark field, their glow bouncing off the rusted barn. The smell of fresh hay filled the air, and the distant chirping of crickets could be heard in the background. But all of that was drowned out by the sharp voice of the woman standing next to the patrol car, her arms crossed, her nose scrunched up as though the very sight of the farm offended her soul. "I told you," Karen said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "This place is a danger to the community. The animals are a threat, it's unsanitary, and if you dig deep enough, I'm sure you'll find something illegal going on here." The officer, a younger guy, didn't seem too impressed, but he still held his clipboard, pretending to take her accusations seriously. I leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching the show with a grin I didn't bother hiding. This wasn't the first time she'd pulled something like this, but it was, without a doubt, her most desperate attempt yet. The officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we got a complaint about this property. Something about," he squinted at his notes, "aggressive animals, zoning violations, and an unauthorized structure." Karen's face lit up like she'd just hit the jackpot. "Yes, that filthy barn. It's an eyesore, it reeks, and it's absolutely tanking the property values around here. It needs to go." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "You called 911 over my barn." "That," she snapped, pointing at me like I was the one who'd set fire to the place, "is not just a barn. It's a breeding ground for disease, and I've had enough. My dog was nearly attacked by one of those monsters you keep on this so-called farm." I didn't even need to ask to know she was talking about Daisy, my goat who had earned a reputation for bullying small dogs. I'd warned Karen before to keep her annoying little purse dog off my property, but she never listened. The officer sighed and shifted his weight, looking like he regretted taking this call. I could tell the moment he realized Karen wasn't going to let him leave without pretending to investigate something. "Look," I said, standing up. "I could explain why everything she's saying is a load of crap, but honestly, I think it'd be easier if I just made a call." Karen laughed sharply. "Oh, please. You can call whoever you want. I have every right to report this. The HOA has rules, and you're breaking them." That's when I started to really enjoy this. Without saying another word, I pulled out my phone and dialed. The line rang once before a deep, gravelly voice picked up. "Yeah. Hey, Uncle Mike," I said casually. "Mind coming over? We've got a situation." There was a pause, then a heavy sigh. "Tell me it's not Karen again." "Oh, it's Karen again," I chuckled. "I'll be there in 5. I hung up, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Karen was still standing there, arms crossed, clearly waiting for some grand explanation. "You," she sneered, "think you can call your farmer friends and scare me into backing down? That won't work. The law is the law," I grinned. "Oh, I agree. That's why I called the sheriff." It took her a moment to process what I had just said. Then, her eyes widened a bit, and her posture shifted just enough for me to notice. What do you mean, the sheriff?" "My uncle," I said, relishing the way her face turned pale. "Sheriff Mike. He's on his way." The officer looked like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, while Karen looked like she had just bitten into a lemon. I let the silence linger, watching her confidence slowly unravel as reality set in. It wasn't just that she had called the cops over something that wasn't even a crime. It was that she had called the cops on the one person who had connections that went way deeper than she could ever dream of. It was the perfect moment to think about how we got here. I had inherited this farm from my grandpa, who had worked the land for decades. It was located just outside the HOA's jurisdiction, technically separate from their control. But that didn't stop Karen from acting like she had authority over my property. From day one, she had shown up, clipboard in hand, listing complaints about everything from the height of my fences to the smell of my compost pile. "You need to get rid of those animals," she had insisted the first time she came by. I had leaned on the porch railing, sipping my coffee slowly. "Karen, it's a farm. They're supposed to be disruptive," I said, motioning to the wide-open fields. Farm. But logic had never been Karen's strong point. When she realized she couldn't bully me into submission, she started escalating things. First, it was passive-aggressive letters. Then she showed up with her little HOA squad, trying to intimidate me. When that didn't work, she started filing complaints, first with the city, then the health department, then animal control. Each time, I shut her down. Every time, she left more furious than the last. And now, she was down to this. I watched as Karen shifted from foot to foot, probably wondering if there was still a way she could twist things in her favor. Before she could decide, a second patrol car pulled up, and out stepped a man built like a grizzly bear with a badge on his chest and a look of pure exhaustion on his face. Sheriff Mike took one look at me, then at Karen, then at the first officer. "Let me guess," he said. "She called 911 over some made-up emergency." Karen stood taller, hands on her hips. "Sheriff, this property is a danger to the neighborhood. That man is breaking the HOA rules." Mike raised a hand, cutting her off. "The HOA rules," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "don't apply to this land." "But," Karen stammered. And he continued, louder this time, "You called 911. Again. Over absolutely nothing." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "This is a serious issue," Sheriff Mike said, turning to the first officer. "What's the supposed crime?" The officer hesitated, glancing down at his notes. Aggressive livestock." I had to bite back a laugh. Mike exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Then, slowly, he turned back to Karen, giving her the kind of look that made grown men nervous. "You do realize," he said, his voice dangerously low, "that calling in a false emergency is a crime, right?" Karen flinched, and for the first time since this whole absurd situation started, I saw real fear in her eyes. I smiled. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Karen's face turned as red as a ripe tomato as she stood there, her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. She had expected this to go her way. She was so sure that just calling 911 and spinning her exaggerated story would be enough to take me down. But now, facing my uncle, the sheriff no less, she was starting to realize she had seriously misjudged the situation. I was just concerned for the safety of the neighborhood," she stammered, trying to get control of the situation again. "This place is a mess. There are animals roaming around, and there's this awful smell, and—" Mike raised a hand, cutting her off instantly. His face was unreadable, but there was a flash of amusement in his eyes as he glanced at me before turning back to Karen. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but carrying that unmistakable authority built from years in law enforcement. "You called 911 because of a smell." Karen's mouth opened and closed, her confidence slipping more with each second. "Well, it's more than that. There are dangerous animals here. I couldn't help it." "You mean Daisy?" At the mention of her name, my goat, my stubborn, fearless, and slightly evil goat, peeked out from behind the barn as if she knew we were talking about her. Karen instinctively took a step back, glaring at Daisy like she was some kind of rabid beast ready to pounce. "She attacked my dog," Karen snapped, pointing a finger at me. I shrugged. "Your dog came onto my land. Daisy doesn't like uninvited guests." The younger officer, who had been silent up until now, glanced between us, struggling to keep a neutral expression. Sheriff Mike, on the other hand, didn't hold back. He crossed his arms over his broad chest and let out a deep sigh. "Karen," he said, his voice flat, "this is the third time you've called emergency services over something that is absolutely not an emergency." "It is an emergency," she shrieked. "He's violating the HOA rules. This whole place is a disaster, and it's dragging down property values. He's running an unregulated operation, and I won't stand for it." Mike pinched the bridge of his nose. "For the last time, this farm is not under the jurisdiction of the HOA. The rules you and your little board enforce do not apply here. You have no authority over this property." Karen's eye twitched. "That can't be right," she snapped. "It has to fall under community regulations." I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened up the digital copy of my property deed. A few taps later, I pulled up the official document and turned the screen toward her. "See for yourself. This land was established outside of HOA control before your neighborhood even existed. My grandfather made sure of it." She snatched the phone from my hand, her eyes darting over the screen. Her face twisted with frustration as she read the words she was so desperate to prove wrong. With a huff, she shoved the phone back at me. "That doesn't mean it's safe," she said, scrambling to recover. "It still needs to be properly inspected. There could be health violations." "There could be," Mike interrupted her again. "Karen, you're not the law. You don't have the right to decide what's safe outside of the HOA boundaries." Karen's desperation was becoming obvious. She had pushed every button she could think of, and none of them had worked. But she wasn't ready to quit yet. Not her. Not Karen. This isn't fair, she spat. He's been harassing the HOA. He keeps ignoring the notices we send. He refuses to cooperate with community guidelines. And now you're just letting him get away with it. I grinned. You mean the fake notices? The ones that have no legal power? Yeah, I ignored those. You've been warned multiple times, she screeched. The HOA has the right to enforce neighborhood standards, and you're violating several of them. Mike raised an eyebrow. Again, this land isn't part of your HOA. Karen's hands balled into fists at her sides, her whole body trembling with frustration. I don't care what your stupid technicalities say. This farm is disgusting, it's disruptive, and it needs to be shut down. I could see the moment Mike lost his patience. His posture straightened, his voice dropping into that calm tone that meant things were about to get serious. Karen, he said slowly, do you understand the consequences of filing a false police report? Her eyes flickered with doubt. This isn't false. It is, he cut in. You called emergency services claiming a crime was being committed. There's no crime here. That means you wasted police resources. That means you interrupted an officer's shift for no reason. And that means you're now facing the possibility of legal consequences. For the first time, real fear showed in Karen's eyes. Wait, what are you saying? Mike pulled a small notepad from his pocket and flipped it open. I'm saying that this is the third time you've misused emergency services. That makes it a pattern of behavior. And if I decide to take this further, that could mean a fine or possibly even charges for repeat offenses. The color drained from her face. You wouldn't. Mike stared at her without flinching. Wouldn't I? Silence hung between them, heavy with unsaid threats. Karen's mouth opened and closed as she scrambled to figure out how to get out of this. This isn't right, she said, her voice quieter now. I was just trying to help the community. Mike sighed. Karen, I'm giving you one last chance. Leave. Now. And don't ever call 911 again unless it's a real emergency. If you do, I'll personally make sure you face the full legal consequences. She clenched her jaw so tight that I thought she might break her own teeth. For a moment, I thought she might argue one last time, but then she turned on her heels and walked away. She stormed off, heading toward her car. Before getting in, she shot one last angry look over her shoulder. This isn't over. I grinned. Oh, I hope it's not. With a forceful slam of her car door, she sped off, tires kicking up gravel as she disappeared down the road. Mike turned to me with a tired look. You enjoy pissing her off, don't you? I shrugged. It's a hobby. The younger officer let out a short laugh before clearing his throat. Well, if there's nothing else, I think we'll head out. Mike nodded. Yeah, I think we're done here. As they got back into their cars, Mike rolled down his window before pulling away. If she comes back, don't engage. Just call me. I gave him a lazy salute. Will do, Sheriff. With that, they drove off, leaving me standing there with the satisfaction of knowing that, for now, Karen had been put in her place. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. People like her never knew when to quit, and I had a feeling she'd be back sooner rather than later. I just hoped that when she did, it would be just as entertaining as tonight had been. A week passed without a single sign of Karen, which was unusual. Normally, she couldn't go more than a couple of days without making her presence known, whether it was through a new HOA complaint, a snarky letter, or just standing at the edge of my property pretending to take notes on some imaginary violations. The silence was unsettling, and I knew it wasn't because she had given up. It was because she was planning something bigger. I wasn't wrong. It started with a letter, this time not just another HOA warning, but an official-looking document claiming that the farm was under investigation for health and safety violations. There was even a fake city seal stamped at the bottom. The whole thing was laughable. I knew Karen had no real legal power to do anything, but she was getting desperate. I was still shaking my head at how ridiculous it all was when I heard a car pull up outside my gate. Looking up, I saw a familiar face stepping out. Bill, one of the few neighbors who actually had a decent head on his shoulders. Unlike most of the HOA board, Bill didn't buy into Karen's nonsense. She's losing it, Bill said as soon as he walked up. I smirked. You're going to have to be more specific. Bill let out a sigh, glancing over his shoulder like he was making sure no one had followed him. She called an emergency HOA meeting last night. Full turnout. She spent an hour going off about how you're a threat to the community and that we need to take legal action. I leaned against the fence, crossing my arms. And, Bill said, rubbing a hand over his face. She's got people actually believing her now. She showed up with some paperwork, claimed she had official complaints filed against your farm with the county. Even had some photos, zoomed-in shots of trash bins, animal droppings, and whatever else she could find to make it look bad. I laughed. So she's playing dirty now. Bill shook his head. Worse. She convinced the HOA board to hire a private investigator to dig up dirt on you. Says she wants to prove you're running some kind of illegal operation. I blinked. Of all the dumb things Karen had done, this was by far the most ridiculous. A private investigator? What? Does she think I'm running some sort of cow smuggling ring out here? Bill let out a short laugh, but quickly sobered. She's desperate, and she's good at stirring people up. The board is actually thinking about using HOA funds to push a lawsuit against you. I sighed, glancing toward the road where Karen's house was tucked just beyond the trees. She wasn't backing down, and if she was willing to use HOA money to come after me, that meant she thought she had enough pull to make it happen. Well, I said, she's in for a surprise. Bill gave me a puzzled look, but I just patted his shoulder and thanked him for the heads up. Once he left, I grabbed my phone and made a call. Uncle Mike picked up on the first ring. Knew you'd be calling sooner or later, he said, amusement in his voice. She's at it again, I said. Only this time, she's committing actual fraud. I explained the fake documents, the private investigator, and her plan to use HOA funds against me. Mike listened in silence before letting out a low chuckle. She just keeps making it easier for me, he said. I'll take care of it. A couple of hours later, I was in the barn feeding the animals when I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple cars pulling up to Karen's house. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped outside, watching as two official-looking vehicles parked right in front of her place. Moments later, Mike stepped out of his patrol car, followed by another man in a suit. From the way Karen stormed out onto her porch, it was clear she hadn't been expecting any visitors. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see Karen's face twist from anger to confusion and then something dangerously close to panic. The man in the suit, who I assumed was from the county, handed her a thick stack of papers. Whatever they were showing her, it wasn't good news. She was waving her arms, her mouth moving a mile a minute, but Mike just stood there, arms crossed, completely unfazed by her usual theatrics. Then, the shouting stopped. Karen's shoulders stiffened, her face drained of color as the man in the suit said something that made her take a step back. Only then did I notice that some of the other HOA board members had come outside, watching from a distance. Some looked concerned, others looked nervous, but the most interesting thing was that none of them stepped in to defend Karen. The standoff ended with Karen storming back inside, slamming the door so hard that the windows rattled. Mike and the county guy exchanged a few words before heading back to their cars. I didn't even have to ask what had just happened. Mike called me a few minutes later to confirm it. She's been officially reported for fraud, he said. That fake document she sent you? Illegal. Misusing HOA funds for personal vendettas? Also illegal. She's looking at some serious trouble. I grinned. Please tell me you have to audit the HOA now. Mike chuckled. Oh, not just me. The county is stepping in too. Turns out Karen's been skimming HOA money for years. She's in deeper than she realizes. This was better than I could have hoped for. Not only was she finally facing real consequences, but her entire grip on power was starting to slip. The next few days were a thing of beauty. HOA members started talking, some pissed off that their money had been misused, others realizing they had blindly followed Karen all this time. Word of a vote to remove her as president spread like wildfire. Of course, Karen did everything she could to fight back. She fired off emails claiming she was being falsely accused, called emergency HOA meetings to rally her supporters, and even went door to door trying to save face. But it was too late. By the end of the week, an official vote was held. I wasn't invited, of course, but Bill made sure to keep me in the loop. She lost, he said, barely able to hide his satisfaction. By a landslide. I leaned back against my porch railing, sipping a beer. Couldn't have happened to a nicer person. She's furious, Bill added. Packed up and left town for a while. Guess she couldn't handle the humiliation. I smirked. Karen wasn't the type to take defeat well, but this time, she didn't have a choice. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace settle over the farm. No more fake violations. No more pointless harassment. No more Karen. Of course, deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. People like her didn't just vanish. They waited, plotted, and came back with new tricks. But if she ever did, well, let's just say I'd be ready. The silence that followed Karen's fall was almost unsettling. After months of dealing with her nonsense, waking up to a day without some new HOA complaint or ridiculous accusation felt strange. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have to worry about her minions showing up on my property, pretending they had the right to tell me what to do. The farm finally felt like it was mine again. News of Karen's forced removal as HOA president spread through the community faster than gossip at a church potluck. Bill had been kind enough to keep me updated, and according to him, it hadn't taken long for the HOA to completely turn on her. The moment they found out she had been misusing funds, manipulating rules, and filing false complaints, the support she once had vanished. Without her iron grip on the board, people started talking, questioning the absurd policies she had pushed over the years. It was like a domino effect. The new HOA president, a guy named Martin who had mostly kept quiet during Karen's reign, took over with a clear goal: undo the mess she had made. Within a week, the board met to overturn some of the most ridiculous rules, including the one about offensive smells that Karen had used to target my farm. It turned out even some of the homeowners had been annoyed by the extreme restrictions Karen had placed on them. Bill told me that during their last meeting, someone suggested refunding the fines Karen had wrongfully imposed over the years. That suggestion nearly caused an uproar, with some board members calling for an audit of everything she had done. The thought that Karen might have to pay back thousands of dollars in unfairly issued fines made me laugh harder than I had in years. Despite all of this, I kept my distance. I had won, and there was no need to rub it in. I knew Karen well enough to understand that even though she was down, she wasn't out. People like her didn't just fade away. They retreated, licked their wounds, and plotted their next move. Sure enough, she came back. It was nearly 2 weeks after she'd lost the vote when I saw her car creeping down the road, stopping just shy of my property line. I was outside fixing the fence, minding my own business, when I saw her get out of the driver's seat. She looked different, less like the self-righteous HOA boss she had been, and more like a woman on the edge of cracking. She stood there for a second, probably debating whether or not she should even try talking to me. I let her stew in her own discomfort, watching as she shifted from foot to foot, her eyes darting around like she expected someone to come to her rescue. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "This is your fault." I raised an eyebrow, wiped my hands on my jeans, and crossed my arms. "Oh, and here I thought you did this all on your own." Her nostrils flared, but the fight wasn't there anymore. "I just wanted to make the neighborhood better." I let out a short laugh. "Better for who? You?" "Because from what I heard, no one else was exactly thrilled with your leadership." She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. Instead, she exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging. "You think this is funny, don't you?" I shrugged. "A little, yeah." She shot me a glare, but didn't have the same fire she used to. For the first time, she actually looked worn out, defeated. It was almost strange seeing her like that. "Do you know what they're doing now?" she asked bitterly. "They're talking about getting rid of half the rules I spent years putting in place. Just throwing them out like they meant nothing." I tilted my head, maybe because they never should have been there in the first place. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she just shook her head and stared at the ground. "I gave everything to that HOA," she muttered. "I put in the time, the effort. I made sure people followed the rules, and this is how they repay me." I had to fight the urge to roll my eyes. "Karen, you didn't run that HOA. You ran a dictatorship. There's a difference." She scoffed. "You wouldn't understand." "No," I said. "I probably wouldn't, because I don't spend my time making other people miserable just to feel important." Her eyes flashed with something close to anger, but it was weak, like she didn't even have the energy to fight back anymore. "You don't get it," she said, her voice quieter now. "I was the one keeping everything together. Without me, this neighborhood is going to fall apart." I gave her a long look, letting her words hang in the silence between us. "Or maybe," I said after a moment, "it's finally going to be a place where people actually want to live." She flinched, just slightly, but I caught it. That tiny reaction told me everything I needed to know. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she was the one saving the neighborhood, the one keeping everything in line. But now, with her out of power, she was forced to face the reality. Nobody wanted her there. For a long moment, she just stood still, her expression unreadable. Then, without saying another word, she turned on her heel and walked back to her car. She didn't slam the door like she usually did. She didn't speed off in some dramatic fashion. She simply got in, started the engine, and drove away. As I watched her disappear down the road, I exhaled a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. That was the last time I saw Karen. The weeks that followed were some of the most peaceful I'd ever had. Without her constantly stirring up trouble, life on the farm returned to normal. HOA meetings became less about enforcing ridiculous rules and more about actual community improvements. People were happier, and for the first time, the neighborhood felt like a place where people could live without fearing fines or pointless restrictions. One day, Bill stopped by with a grin on his face. "You'll love this," he said, handing me an envelope. I opened it, my eyebrows shooting up at what was inside. A check, signed by the new HOA board, refunding every single fine Karen had ever tried to impose on me. "Figured you deserved it," Bill said. "Consider it a thank you gift for finally getting rid of her." I chuckled, slipping the check into my pocket. "I didn't get rid of her. She did that to herself." Bill nodded. "Yeah, but you sure helped speed things along." I grinned, happy to be of service. As he drove off, I turned back toward the farm, taking in the sight of my land, my animals, my home. For the first time in a long time, there were no threats hanging over my head. No looming battles with Karen. No pointless fights with the HOA. Just peace. And if Karen ever thought about coming back, well, I'd be ready. Months passed, and life settled into a steady rhythm. Without Karen constantly breathing down my neck, the farm flourished. The animals were healthier, the crops grew stronger, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could focus on my work without the ever-present threat of another HOA scheme. The neighborhood itself seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. People who had once been too afraid to speak out were now openly discussing changes to the HOA rules, questioning the ones Karen had put in place. It was a new era, one where common sense actually had a shot. I had almost started to believe Karen was gone for good. That was, until the day I received an official-looking letter in the mail. The return address unfamiliar, but the energy behind it unmistakable. I tore it open, already knowing I wasn't going to like what I found. Inside was a notice stating that my property was under review for a possible zoning violation. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint with the county, claiming that my farm was operating outside the proper agricultural guidelines. The letter was vague, full of bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo, but the message was clear. Someone was trying to stir up trouble for me again. I didn't need to guess who. Karen might have been out of the HOA, but she wasn't done with me. If she couldn't control the neighborhood with her usual methods, it was clear Karen had decided to take things up a notch. With a sigh, I pulled out my phone and dialed the one person who would know exactly what to do. Mike picked up on the first ring. "She's at it again, isn't she?" he said. "She never learns," I muttered. "I just got a notice about a zoning violation. Apparently, my farm's being reviewed." Mike let out a low chuckle. "That woman's got more lives than a stray cat. All right, don't do anything yet. Let me make a few calls and see what's going on." I thanked him and hung up, my mind already running through possibilities. Karen may have lost her position of power, but she was still trying to fight from the shadows. The fact that she had gone straight to the county meant she was desperate. She was grasping at anything, trying to make my life harder. By the next morning, Mike had updates. He showed up at the farm with a folder in hand, shaking his head as he walked up to my porch. "You're not going to believe this," he said, handing me the documents. I flipped through the pages, scanning the contents. The complaint against me was filled with false claims, accusations of overbreeding livestock, improperly disposing of waste, and even that my animals were causing environmental damage to the neighboring properties. It was a laundry list of nonsense, all carefully crafted to make it seem like I was running some illegal operation. "She really went all out," I said, letting out a low whistle. Mike smirked. "The best part? The county already dismissed most of it. Turns out, they did a preliminary review before even contacting you. The only reason you got that letter is because some paper pusher followed protocol before checking the facts. So it's already dead in the water?" I asked. "For the most part," Mike said. "But Karen's not done. She's been going around town, stirring people up again. I heard from a buddy of mine that she's trying to rally support from other property owners, getting them to file complaints too." I sighed. She really doesn't know when to quit. Mike leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed. She's hoping that if she throws enough dirt, something will stick. But here's the thing, people are tired of her. She burned too many bridges. The same board members who used to follow her orders are the ones pushing back now. That thought was satisfying. Karen had spent years manipulating the HOA, twisting rules, and bullying people into submission. Now, the very people she'd once controlled were refusing to back her up. Still, I knew better than to think she would give up easily. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. If she was already willing to take her fight beyond the HOA, it meant she was getting desperate. And desperate people did stupid things. It didn't take long before my suspicion was proven right. A few days later, I noticed movement near the edge of my property. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor passing through, but something felt off. The way they moved, the way they lingered near the fence, it wasn't normal. I grabbed my binoculars and took a closer look. Sure enough, it was Karen. She was standing just past my property line, holding a phone up in front of her face, clearly recording something. Every now and then, she would gesture dramatically toward my land, as if she were narrating some big expose. I couldn't help but laugh quietly, shaking my head. Unbelievable. She still hadn't learned. She was still trying to build a case, looking for anything she could use against me. And, by the looks of it, she was trying to create her own evidence. I had two choices. I could ignore her, let her waste her time standing there talking to her phone like a crazy person. Or, I could have a little fun with it. I went with the second option. Without hesitation, I walked over to the fence, making sure she saw me coming. She stiffened but didn't back off. Instead, she lifted her chin, trying to keep up some illusion of control. "Karen," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Enjoying the view?" She narrowed her eyes. "I'm documenting this. The people deserve to know what's going on here." I smirked. "What exactly are you documenting? The grass? The perfectly legal farm operations?" She huffed. "You think you're untouchable, but I'm not giving up. I will prove that you're violating regulations." I nodded slowly, pretending to think about it. Then I pulled out my own phone and started recording her. She froze. "What are you doing?" "Just documenting," I said, mimicking her tone. "The people deserve to know what's going on here, after all." Her face twisted with frustration. "You can't record me." I shrugged. "Sure I can. Public road, remember? You're the one standing here filming me. Fair's fair." For a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue, but then she clamped her mouth shut. Her face was a mix of anger and uncertainty, and I could tell she was realizing just how ridiculous she looked. Without saying another word, she turned on her heel and stormed off, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand. I watched her walk away, a satisfied grin spreading across my face. She had lost. She knew it. And yet, she still couldn't let it go. But the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. She could make all the fake complaints she wanted, waste all her time recording nonsense, but no one was listening to her anymore. She had completely ruined her own credibility. And as I stood there, watching her disappear down the road, I knew one thing for sure. No matter what she tried next, no matter how desperate she got, she was never going to win. Not against me, not against the farm, and definitely not against the truth.